am presenting Union Gospel Press's Sunday School Lesson number 9, Sunday, October 30th, 2022. The lesson is entitled Obedience in Feast. Lesson text comes from Leviticus chapter 23, verses 33 through 43. Related scriptures are Numbers chapter 29, verses 12 through 38, Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 13 through 17, Nehemiah chapter 8, verses 13 through 18, Zechariah chapter 14, verses 16 through 19. The place is Mount Sinai. The time is 1445 BC. Our last lesson on obedience in worship is on the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. It is a bit like having a camp out in the living room to remind the family of a canoeing trip in the outdoors that was very special. For the Jews, it was to remind them of a time when the Lord delivered them from slavery in Egypt and set them on a journey to their new home. As they journeyed to the promised land, they lived in temporary dwellings, tents. The Feast of Booths was to be a time of rejoicing in the Lord and his deliverance. Remind your class that as Christians, we are urged to rejoice in the Lord constantly, Philippians 4:4, not just at one particular holiday. Also, we are in a wilderness that is foreign to our true country, heaven. We should be celebrating our salvation, the time when our Lord delivered us from slavery to sin and its consequences. We also celebrate our citizenship in heaven and relish the journey because of its destination. Today's aim, facts, to see how the Lord ordered the feast and why. Principle, to realize that the appointments of the Lord will help us understand our present standing in the Lord. Application, to make rejoicing in the Lord our constant spiritual habit. Illustrating the lesson. The bread and the cup remind us of Jesus' death. We are to also look forward to living with him forever. Practical points. 1. God's words to Moses speak to us as well. Leviticus 23:33. 2. Today's Christians could spend more time worshiping and celebrating God. Verse 34. 3. A day of rest from normal routine allows us to focus on what is really important. Verses 35 through 39. 4. God provides for us in our desert experiences. Thus, we should rejoice. Verse 40. 5. God's blessings should be shared and celebrated with others. Verses 41 through 42. 6. Humans are prone to forget. We need frequent reminders of God's goodness to us. Verse 43. Golden text. Ye shall dwell in booths 7 days. All that are Israelites born shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. Leviticus 23:42 to 43. Today we have 3 lesson outlines. The first is the schedule for the feast, coming from Leviticus 23:33 through 36. The second is the offerings for all the feasts, Leviticus 23:37 through 38. And the third is a fuller description of the feast, Leviticus 23:39 through 43. Introduction. Harvest festivals abound in every part of the world. In addition to National Thanksgiving Day celebrations in the United States and Canada, scores of local and regional festivals are held in various parts of North America. These festivals often center on the harvest of a particular crop. In the United States, for example, they celebrate such food products as apples, pumpkins, cranberries, grapes, tomatoes, peanuts, pecans, and seafood. Rice is celebrated in India, and in the Philippines, olives. In the Philippines, olives in Italy, flowers in Portugal, grain in the United Kingdom, eggplants in Albania, spices in Romania, and yams in parts of Africa. Modern America harvest festivals is Israel Sukkot booths, but this celebration is not modern in origin. It is ancient, originating in the law of Moses. It is this feast that we will examine in this lesson of our unit on obedience and worship. The schedule for the feast. Leviticus 23:33. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, verse 34, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, The 15th day of this 7th month shall be the feast of the tabernacle for 7 days unto the Lord. Verse 35. And on the first day shall be an holy convocation. Ye shall do no servile work therein. Verse 36. 7 days shall ye offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. On the 8th day shall be an holy convocation unto you, and ye shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. It is a solemn assembly, and ye shall do no servile work therein. The time of year, Leviticus 23:33 through 34. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, is found here for the 5th time in this chapter. Each time it introduces a festival Israel was to observe. The other 4, verses 1, 9, 23, and 26, detailed the weekly Sabbaths and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the unwavering of the sheaf of first fruits of the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Trumpets, and the Day of Atonement. Thus, the Feast of Booths was a celebration initiated by a divine commandment, and it was the last in the annual cycle of feasts. It was one of the pilgrimage feasts when all Israelite males were to appear before the Lord, Exodus 23:14 through 17, and be prepared to give generously to him, Deuteronomy 16:16 through 17. The Festival of Booths, also known as Tabernacles, was so named because during those days the people were to construct booths in which to live. It was also referred to as the Feast of Ingathering, Exodus 23:16, 34, 22. Israel was to begin this celebration on the 15th day of this 7th month, Leviticus 23:34. This 7th month on the Hebrew calendar was Tishri, which elsewhere is said to be in the end of the year, Exodus 23:16. This refers to the ending of the agricultural cycle. The 15th day of the 7th month was only 5 days after the Day of Atonement, Leviticus 23:34, verse 27. The two are in striking contrast. The Day of Atonement was the most solemn day of the year, while the Feast of Booths was a week of joyful celebration. The order and close proximity of the two, however, make perfect sense. On the Day of Atonement, the Israelites confessed their sins and cleansed their lives. Now they were prepared to rejoice unreservedly and thank God for his blessings and pure heart. This principle of sorrow for sin preceding joy is found throughout Scripture. David could not rejoice before God until he had agonized over the enormity of his sins, Psalms 32 and 51. The people of Nehemiah's day could rejoice and celebrate the Feast of Booths only after they had allowed the law of the Lord to convict them of sin, Nehemiah 8 through 12, 14 through 18. And we today cannot enjoy the blessings of our salvation as long as we harbor unconfessed sin, James 4:8 through 10. The times of the convocations, Leviticus 23:35 through 36. The Feast of Booths was to last 7 days, verse 34. And although it was a time of joy, this was not a period of unbridled rivalry. all Israel's rejoicing was to be unto the Lord, and the first day was to be an holy convocation. Verse 35. This was a sacred assembly convened exclusively for activities of worship. On pilgrimage festival days, all Israelite males were to be present, and their assembly had to be at the central location that the Lord would choose. Deuteronomy 12, 5 through 11, 16, 15. Since the Israelites were still in the wilderness when these instructions were given, the location of the sanctuary had not yet been established. When they reached Canaan, the tabernacle was set up in Shiloh, Joshua 18:1, where it remained until the ark was taken by the Philistines. 1 Samuel 4, 3 through 11. Thereafter, there was no central sanctuary until David placed the tabernacle in Jerusalem, where Solomon later built the temple. He chose the Feast of Booths as the occasion for the temple's dedication. 1 Kings 8, 1 through 2. The day of convocation at this feast, like those of the other festivals, was to be treated as a Sabbath. During that day, they were to do no servile work. Leviticus 23:35, verses 7 through 8, 21, 25. The Hebrew phrase could be translated laborious work, as it refers to work done as service. The general word for work is used alone when speaking of work prohibitions on the regular Sabbath and the Day of Atonement. Verse 3, 28, 30 through 31. The prohibition against servile work, verse 35, seems to have allowed room for the preparation of meals. Verse 36 outlines the activities for the days of the festival. 7 days ye shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. A more detailed account of these offerings is given in Numbers 29, 12 through 34. Indeed, the offerings of this feast, 189 animals, outnumbered those in any other. This consisted of 7 bullocks, 14 rams, 98 lambs, and 7 goats during the 7-day period. All those except the goats were also accompanied by grain and drink offerings. The daily burnt offerings also continue. This multiplicity of sacrifices was appropriate for the time and nature of the feast. First, it was the culmination of all the annual harvest festivals, and a greater celebration was thus expected. Second, it was a Thanksgiving festival, and thanks to God overflowed in the number of sacrifices offered. And to these, the joyful nature of the occasion when families and friends celebrated, Deuteronomy 16, 13 through 14, and the abundance of offerings becomes understandable. Although this was a 7-day festival, the 8th day was to be set apart as a sacred assembly. Like the first day, the 8th was a Sabbath featuring sacrifices and a solemn closing assembly. The sacrifices were simple in comparison to those of preceding 7 days: 1 bull, 1 ram, 7 lambs, and 1 goat. Numbers 29, 35 through 38. The 8th day was not strictly part of the feast itself. It was appended as a conclusion to the entire annual cycle of feasts. With social fellowship ended, Israel concluded its growing season in solemn meditation on the blessings of the Lord. The offerings for all the feasts, verse 37. These are the feast of the Lord, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, to offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord, a burnt offering and a meat offering, a sacrifice and drink offerings, everything upon this day. Verse 38. Besides the Sabbaths of the Lord, and beside your gifts, and beside all your vows, and beside all your free will offerings, which ye give unto the Lord. These 2 verses are parentheses in the instructions for the Feast of Booths. Following logically from the conclusion to the festival cycle on the 8th day, verse 36, These summarize all the feasts. These are the feasts of the Lord. Verse 37 echoes earlier statements. The feasts are alike in two ways. First, they are holy convocations. This describes the Feast of Unleavened Bread, verse 6 through 8, weeks, verse 21, trumpets, verse 42, the Day of Atonement, verse 27, and booths, verse 35. All sacred assemblies to honor the God of Israel. Second, they offered prescribed sacrifices. Offerings were to be made by fire to the Lord, including burnt offerings, grain offerings, sacrificial meals, and drink offerings, each on the appropriate day. They differed with the festival as noted, but all of them were offered on the altar. Even drink offerings were poured on the sacrifices as they were consumed. These offerings on festival days were distinct from other offerings. Among these others were those pertaining to the Lord's Sabbaths, Numbers 28, 9 through 10. Distinct from these were personal gifts, Leviticus 23, 38, such as those recorded in Numbers 7, and peace offerings that were either free will or votive, Leviticus 22, 17 through 25. Also distinct, though not mentioned here, were monthly new moon offerings, number 28, 11 through 15. Festival offerings were in addition to all of these. A fuller description of the feast, verse 39. Also in the 15th day of the 7th month, when ye have gathered in the fruit of the land, ye shall keep at least unto the Lord 7 days. On the first day shall be a Sabbath, and on the 8th day shall be a Sabbath. Verse 40. And ye shall take you on the first day the boughs of goodly trees, branches of palm trees, and the boughs of thick trees and willows of the brook, and ye shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. Verse 41. And ye shall keep it a feast unto the Lord 7 days in the year. It shall be a statute forever in your generations. Ye shall celebrate it in the 7th month. Verse 42. Ye shall dwell in booths 7 days. All that are Israelites born shall dwell in booths. Verse 43. That your generations may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. The schedule restated, Leviticus 23:39. Following the brief digression regarding offerings on festival days, our text returns to a description of the festival of booths. The time of the feast is again stated, and the 1st and 8th days are specifically called Sabbaths. But here the occasion for the feast is more clearly implied, for it took place after the crops of the land had been gathered in. This agrees with the title given in Exodus 23:16 and 34:22, the Feast of Ingathering, whereas the Feast of Unleavened Bread and weeks were associated with the grain harvest. This one celebrates the harvest of the latter crops as well, Deuteronomy 16:13, grapes, olives, and dates. The manner of observance, Leviticus 23:40 through 42. The boughs of trees had major role in this feast. They were to be gathered on the first day and would play a part in Israel's rejoicing. Nothing is said of how they were to be used, but it becomes clear that the booths in which Israel were to dwell temporarily were to be constructed from them. Nehemiah 8:15. Goodly trees, Leviticus 23:40, appears to be a generic term to describe all the trees that follow. Goodly can also be translated beautiful or ornamental. Thick trees should be interpreted as trees thick in foliage, leafy shade trees. Willows of the brook can also be taken as polars. The trees listed here are not the only ones used, as is evident from those used in Nehemiah's day, which include olive, pine, and myrtle, Nehemiah 8:15. It may be that people use whatever was available. The keynote of the feast is found in the command to rejoice before the Lord for 7 days. This is made even more emphatic in Deuteronomy 16:14 through 15. Only a few days before Israelites were commanded to deny themselves on the Day of Atonement, Leviticus 23:27, they were now to give themselves over to joy. They could rejoice in social fellowship, bountiful harvest, and the Lord's faithful provision. But most of all, they could rejoice in His grace, which had granted them forgiveness of their sins. The observance of the Feast of Booths was a divine statute throughout all their generations. It was to be celebrated perpetually. Ironically, from Israelites' interest into Canaan until the Babylonian exile, there is only one documented observance of this feast, when Solomon dedicated the temple. 1 Kings 8:2, 2 Chronicles 7:8 through 10. If there were any observances besides this, we know that they were only partial and did not include living in booths. Nehemiah 8:17. After the exile, the festival was observed more regularly and strictly. New features were added, such as the drawing of water from the pool of Shalom and pouring it into a basin at the foot of the altar of sacrifice. This provided the occasion for Jesus to promise the living water of the Holy Spirit to all who believed in Him. John 7:2, 37 through 39. During the 7 days of the festival, the Israelites had to live in booths. Leviticus 23:42. This rule applied to all that are Israelites born, that is, all those native born in Israel. The booths were made from the trees they had cut down. Nehemiah 8:14 through 16. The reason of the observance. Leviticus 23:43. The Feast of Booths may have been a harvest festival, but the reason for its name and the practice of living in booths was distinct from this. It was to ensure that generations to come may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. There is no specific reference elsewhere to living in booths at that time, for tents comes from a different Hebrew root. There is, however, a reference to an area in which Egypt, through which the Israelites passed, called Sirkith, booths, Exodus 12:37, 13:20. Since place names often reflected some event that occurred there, it is possible that some Israelites used booths for protection at that time. Genesis 33:17. Perhaps the word need not be taken literally, since the word translated booth is sometimes translated other ways, such as pavilion, Psalms 31:20, or tabernacle, Isaiah 4:6, Amos 9:11. The major lesson to be learned from living in booths for 7 days was not the privations their ancestors suffered in the desert. That would have been inconsistent with the atmosphere of the joy this feast was supposed to bring. It was rather that the Lord kept His protective hand over them, sheltering them from the elements and providing for all their needs. Psalms 27:5, 31:20. The Feast of Booths looks forward prophetically as well as backwards historically. It will apparently be celebrated in the millennium, Zechariah 14:16 through 19, Matthew 17:4. It prefigures the renewal of the falling booths shelter of David, Amos 9:11. Meanwhile, it reminds us that every harvest season should turn our thoughts to the one who made it possible. We should offer Him praise and thanksgiving and rejoice in His provision for all our needs. Questions. 1. At what season of the year was the Feast of Booths held? 2. What do we learn from the time of this feast in relation to the Day of Atonement? 3. What was the nature of the first day of the Feast of Booths? 4. What was the great number of sacrificial animals appropriate for this occasion? 5. What was the purpose for the assembly on the 8th day? 6. How were all the festivals of Israel alike? 7. What kinds of branches were cut down at this feast? Why? 8. How many references to the historical observance of this feast are found in the Old Testament? 9. What was the significance of the booths the Israelites made? 10. What role does this festival have in prophecy? What does it teach us today? This concludes the Sunday school lesson for Sunday, October 30th, 2022. Thank you for listening. God bless.